not just a cost associated with those people, but also a human being. A person who now lives their life as a convict is somebody who's spent time in prison or is in prison, who before was a normal functioning member of our society.
Yeah, and it's a lot of different ways of counting and accounting for that type of thing. If we were to look to Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and talk about an investment in reconstructing these countries, now whether we're going to do it or not is another question, but is there a way to even think about what that might cost if that were to happen?
I think there's been, at the same time as we've been fighting, we've been reconstructing Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's not just the United States who's been participating in the reconstruction. Enormous quantities of money have come from other countries. And again, it's sort of inadequate in the sense that the destruction continues. For instance, recently it was estimated that the United States paid $1 million was it much more than that? I don't recall the number, of money to repair homes that it had destroyed in southern Afghanistan in an offensive. The Afghans asked for something like 20 times the amount the U.S. paid to repair the homes. And that kind of reconstruction need goes essentially unmet, though there are individual cases of compensation, or solitia payments as they're called. Many of the small-scale things don't get fixed. And the larger-scale problems, reconstruction efforts have their own problems, and that the special investigator for Inspector General for Iraq and Afghanistan has documented much fraud and abuse in the reconstruction program. So it's a mixed story there. There is a lot of reconstruction and unmet need, and then some money that we just don't know what happens
and
to.
There's money that's just disappearing.
It's lost
into the system. Yeah.
I'd like to comment on the theme of democracy or empire in relation to this cost issue. It can be said that the United States has never sought territory in these invasions. It could be said that sometimes a major motivation is access to oil. That's debatable, but probably it's true. But in any case, one is creating a liability for the people there. And although we do not seek empire, the tragedy is that we are seen as imperialist by people in many, many countries throughout the world, particularly in Islamic countries that identify with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. So it's not that we want empire, probably. We may want oil, but we don't want empire. But we need to find ways to encourage democracy worldwide without being violent and without creating a counterproductive effect.
Right. I mean, if democracy is the same as self-determination for a community or for a country, it's hard to see how democracy can be imposed in this way. That's right.
Democracy at the point of a gun.
At least not very effectively.
Not very well.
Let's get into that in a minute when I want to talk about the moral cost of this. But before we get there, I want to come back to some other economic issues, including jobs. Now, of course, any time you're spending money, you're creating jobs. And right now there's a big debate going on about the military budget overall, and of course there's a big debate over unemployment or underemployment in this country. I wonder if you could bring up that slide about jobs while we talk about it, talking about potential jobs created by military spending. Can you explain this one to us? I mean, what are we looking at here when we're comparing jobs created in different sectors?
Okay, think about $1 million spent
All right.
in any way you could spend it. Okay, let's say if we spend $1 million
At
in
the mall? No. All right.
no.
Anyway, all right. All right.
Let's say you spend $1 million on defense
All right.
and security. You create about 8 jobs, directly or indirectly, and those are real jobs for real people with some
Right.
with high salaries. And then, however, if you spent the money another way, if you spent the money looking at wind and solar, or construction or healthcare or education, you get many more jobs. So jobs in education per $1 million is about 15, so nearly twice the number for military spending. Or if you spend $1 million on healthcare, you get 14 jobs per $1 million spent. Now then aggregate that. We've spent many millions, billions, trillions. Right, so the Pentagon says if we reduce military spending in the United States by $1 trillion over the next 10 years, that'll cost 1 million jobs. But when they say that, they're not telling us what that money could be better used for. So that trillion could create many more millions of jobs, and with direct and indirect effects. So that slide showed the comparatively, the number of jobs for, let's say, it's almost a year's budget on the wars alone, and you'd get tens of thousands of jobs spent if that money were spent another way.
Lucy, if we start bringing all these troops home, and they come into this economy where it's very difficult for people to get jobs, I mean, do you have an ability to assess what the impact of that will be? Both on the labor market overall,
one of the few
and on those people,
useful things that Congress has done in the last week or two is to make special provisions for returning veterans to have access to jobs. But no, in a very, very low key economy, in a recession such as we have now, it is a major problem, and I think that it's very important that the nation take responsibility for creating more jobs, taking action to create a budget that allows for more jobs, which might mean that we have to have some of the billionaires pay the same proportion of their income as other people pay of theirs.
That's
well,
right.
Let me just intervene on that a little bit and think about the long run, the 10 years we've just been spending all this money. It's arguable, and probably we could make a good case to say that without this high rate of military spending and borrowing, interest rates would be lower. They'd be lower by about 0.3%, which on a mortgage is a lot, over a year and over 30 years. There would be more jobs in the U.S. economy. Now, when the United States embarked on these wars in 2001, of course, we underestimated how much they would cost and the interest rates that would have to be, the interest that would have to be paid. But we also didn't use that money to invest in infrastructure. And infrastructural investment would have actually increased productivity in the U.S. economy quite a bit. So I think that...
What do you mean by infrastructure in this case?
In this case, we're talking roads, railroads, electrical infrastructure, bridges, things which are being repaired slowly, but they could be repaired at a much greater rate. There are efficiencies in the economy which could have been gained, and that would have helped increase employment and decreased, I think, some of these other more pernicious but subtle effects of military spending.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious if the young people right now that are being lured into or attracted into military service, are they still being told that this is a good way to get training, to get a job for when they get out?
I've seen a great deal of marketing along those lines that that you can get training to use in the civilian world, and there are some choices in the military that will give you that. They're not the most efficient or effective way to get that training, but that's definitely part of a recruiter's pitch.
Yeah.
That, in my case, I was an infantryman, so so
what the skill was you were going to bring back.
The civilian application of that particular job is nil. There's nothing.
We're glad for that, actually.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, what do you think is the sort of the moral cost of this decade of war here for our country?
Well, I mean, I have a personal moral cost.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to Iraq, and I knew that war was illegal. I knew that the people who were fighting there had a right to defend their country from a foreign invader. I was more afraid of going to jail and living with the labels convict, traitor, coward than I was of going and doing that, and I went and I did things that were bigger than I am as a single human being.
Yeah.
And I live with that for every day. I think about what I did and what that means for me as a human being. That I was there, that I pointed guns at families, that I pulled the trigger, and that I was willing to go to that extent to bring myself home. But I morally what I was forced to do. And maybe I wasn't forced. Maybe I don't gotta. Maybe I could have stepped back and said, and said, no, I'm not going to be a part of this, and done my time in jail. But I, just as a personal moral cost for each soldier that has to go and then defend to themselves what they've done and what they've been a part of, it's huge.
So that's part of the cost of empire. Then, because you add that up, thousands, millions of times, perhaps, in terms of other people. I mean, what do you see from your vantage point, Lucy, about the moral cost of this decade of war?
Well, I think the the whole phenomenon of these two wars undermines the moral authority of the United States. When I was in those parts of the world in the mid-50s, Americans were very, very much respected and welcomed, and I was always treated with great honor as coming from the country that had created the Marshall Plan and helped to defeat the Nazis and so forth. Now I think there's a great revulsion against our country due to its violent and military activities.
So that's a sad development. Now,
And-
I think
and
a lot
also-
of Americans basically probably still think that these wars were waged perhaps for good motivation. I mean, is there a
Maybe
way
the
to address
motivation
that?
was okay, but it wasn't seen that way from other perspectives.
Yeah.
And it has also led to a lot of blowback, a lot of
What do you mean by blowback?
recruitment of additional terrorists in these countries that have been invaded by the United States and its friends.
Yeah, is that something that could be measured, Professor Crawford? Do we have a way of sort of
Yes.
measuring blowback and
Yeah.
that type of effect? So what does it look like from that angle?
Well, at certain points, various commanders have said we've been our own worst enemy in Iraq and Afghanistan because when we kill civilians, either intentionally, as in Haditha, when the soldiers snap and go out and try to find civilians to hurt,
Yeah.
or inadvertently, with indiscriminate fire or bombs that kill civilians that weren't intended to kill civilians. They've said we need to reduce that because it causes the recruitment of insurgents. And so they estimate that for every individual civilian killed, there's maybe 10 more people who are moved to the other side. Now, not all those people take up guns. They may support somebody who takes up guns. They call it the mathematics of insurgency or the arithmetic of insurgency, that when you hurt civilians, you make the trouble worse for yourself.
Right.
And that's behind much of the impetus post-2006 for the U.S. to really decrease the number of civilians it's killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so they changed rules of engagement to try to reduce those deaths, but there's still a concern that each additional civilian harmed means somebody else who's going to pick up a weapon.
Right. So there's a lot of ways of assessing the cost here in different types of equations to draw out here, and we haven't had time to talk about the consumption of oil. We haven't had time to talk about environmental damage. We haven't had time to talk in much detail about public health and other issues, but I do wonder if we could spend a couple minutes talking about some alternatives and then talk a little bit about the political context in which this discussion is taking place right now as we wrap up. So what have we got in mind for alternatives, Lucy? I mean, you said already this didn't have to happen.
Well, I think both Neta and I believe that there's a legal approach which is not a violent military approach. Now, this would have been difficult in the case of trying to apprehend Osama bin Laden after 9/11, but it might have been possible to have sent in a small team and even had a bit of collusion from the Taliban government to capture him and get him out of the country. And although the International Criminal Court was not really fully operative at that point, it is now.
Well, but the United States is not a member of it.
That doesn't really matter.
Oh, it doesn't. All right.
The United States has been relating to the
Okay,
ICC
all right.
in quite a positive way, in spite of having not joined it. So that's one big difference.
So that would be a way to approach it.
Another difference is the attitude of Western countries that can be expanded. At the present time, the UK and France have indicated their support for the insurgency in Syria, but they have told the Syrian insurgency, please do not use violence. So there's obviously an awareness of the counterproductive nature of creating a real civil war there.
So finding some ways to look for alternatives. Do you think that this is anywhere in the political discourse at this time? Is this something that President Obama is looking at, or any of the Republican candidates that are amongst us are talking about?
I would like to ask President Obama and several of the Republican candidates what they think about this, but I do believe that President Obama, being a person who believes in conciliation and cooperation, is always ready to find less violent ways, less counterproductive ways of moving forward.
All right, we should hope so. I mean, he's getting some criticism, I think, from his political adversaries, perhaps, for that. How do you assess the political discourse right now around these cost of war questions? Is this in the discussion at all? In the discussion in Congress about the budget and the super committee and sequestration, all these things, are they even looking into this $1 trillion price tag?
Well, any budget cut that the United States Congress would make to the Pentagon would not, in fact, bring it to below what it was in 2001. So some of these changes in the base budget are with us well into the future.
Yeah.
But I think I want to go back to two other things that you
Okay, good.
mentioned. First is about the alternatives. Clearly, international policing and sanctions and strengthening ports were tried, but the bulk of the U.S. effort went to military force in Afghanistan and then Iraq and now Pakistan to use these alternative methods. It would have been cheaper, arguably more effective, and I think would have left the United States with a greater well of respect, as you suggested. And then let's go back even further to something you asked earlier about ethics and justice. What's not on the political horizon today is the way that we talk about making these decisions about going to war. They're made by a small group of people who say that we should go to war, and we're meant as a public to sort of agree and go along. I think that we're out of the habit of a serious discussion about both the long-term costs of war, but also the justice of going to war. Is war right? Is it effective? And I'd ask any candidate this question: how would you include the American people in a discourse, a real discussion, not just a cheerleading exercise about going to war in the future? And how would you like us to make more transparent for you the real costs of going to war? Do we need more hearings? How can we make the Pentagon budget more transparent and accountable? Those are the kinds of questions I'd ask.
I mean, do we need a declaration of war at this point? I mean, there's a whole lot of questions about that. What is the role of the Congress even in approving something like
Right.
this?
Congress is increasingly quiescent, that is, asleep on these questions,
right.
and it's a shame.
Yeah. Will, I'm curious from your perspective, you've now been watching the presidential candidates coming and going. I don't know if you've had a chance to talk to some of them, but how would you ask the question if you were called on at a town hall meeting?
Well, it's a difficult question to ask because the debate exists so far from reality right now. You don't need to go much further than the counterinsurgency manual to figure out some of the basics of what's going on in Afghanistan in particular. They've got over and over and over again, the counterinsurgency field manual recognizes that as you add more troops until you hit this magic ratio, violence increases, that things get worse for you because of the collateral damage we've been talking about, that you kill one civilian and 10 people turn against you. And as you increase action until you hit, and the counterinsurgency field manual holds an optimal insurgency level at 28 per 1,000, 28 troops per 1,000 civilians, but as a bare minimum, 20 per 1,000. In Afghanistan, that would be 567,000 combat troops. So we're at about 18% of that if you count the Allied forces right now. And it's a simply unsustainable level. You can't equip that number of people through the Khyber Pass. The reality of what's going on in Afghanistan is we've tried surges, but we're not even coming close to counterinsurgent levels. All we're doing is making things worse, and indeed we've seen the numbers. We've seen civilian casualties go up, troop casualties go up, and we've seen public opinion polls of the Taliban increasing through these surges. And so the reality is that the what's going on in Afghanistan is completely absent from the debate in both parties. Somehow we're ignoring the reality that what we're doing is counterproductive. It's making enemies. So from where I stand, I think we just need to, we need to ask them if you want to continue the war in Afghanistan, are you willing to put the number of troops that are going to take? Because if they are, well, that'll bankrupt us. We can't afford it, and frankly it's impossible. And otherwise, what is your plan? How are you going to try to make something positive here?
How to make something.
How do you step forward and do something that is not what we've been doing for the past 10 years?
Well, it's certainly my hope that people watching this show today will get out there into the streets or into those town hall forums and talk to the candidates who are coming around. We've got another couple months for this, and hopefully this show will help drive home the point that we're trying to make. War is costly, peace is priceless, and we have a choice between democracy or empire in this country. This series is going to continue. Our next show is going to be about the cost of intelligence with former CIA analyst Ray McGovern and former FBI whistleblower Colleen Rowley. So I hope people get to tune in for that, and I want to thank our guest today, Lucy Law Webster, Professor Neta Crawford, and Will Hopkins for being with us here on Democracy or Empire. Thank you very much.